Within the next hour, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to sell anything to anyone. Now, in case you don't know me, you see me for the first time, I'm Vuk Stilkovic. I've been an online marketer for roughly half a decade, and today I'm going to try to put all that knowledge, all half a decade of marketing knowledge, into one video. So, the first thing we need to discuss is the way you view selling. Because chances are, if you're like most people, you believe that selling equals making your product sound good, right? You believe that this is the formula to selling, that this is what selling essentially is, right? Right. Well, here's the problem. This, my friend, is absolute bullshit. This has nothing, or at the very best, very little to do with selling. So then the question becomes, well, if selling isn't making your product sound good, what is it? Like, what even is selling about? Right, right. Well, selling is about taking people from pain aware to solution aware. And here's what that essentially really means. So there are three levels of awareness in any market or any person. There's number one, pain aware. Number two, problem aware. And number three, solution aware. Now, your job as a salesperson or as a marketer, or even as a businessman, woman, business owner who just wants to sell more of his products, is to take people from pain aware to solution aware and then show them how your product fulfills on this solution the best, easiest, quickest, and most cost efficient way. Same applies to here, problem aware to solution aware. Now, with that being said, I know that sounds very insightful, but how does that actually work, right? How do we actually do this? How do we take people from stage number one to stage number three, solution aware? Well, to answer this question, let's just take a look at some of the best people in the world who use this exact formula. Doctors. And I know that's probably not the first person that comes to mind when you think brilliant salesperson, but let's just think about it. What does a doctor do? Well, firstly, you go to a doctor because you have pain. Let's just say your shoulder's been hurting and it's been going on for a couple of weeks, maybe even a month. You thought to yourself, just leave it and the pain will eventually just go away. But it hasn't, right? Your shoulder's kind of been hurting for a month or so, so you decide to go to a doctor. Completely normal thing to do. And what's the doctor then going to do? Well, the doctor is then going to ask you questions, right? To determine the problem, to determine what is behind this shoulder pain of yours, right? Right. It's going to ask you, well, since when has this started? Like, how long have you had this pain for? What have you done before this has developed? Like, have you slept in a weird position? Actually, I don't really know what exact questions you would ask. Again, I'm not a doctor, a medical professional. But you get the point. You've been to a doctor before, you know what they do. All in hopes to uncover the underlying problem. And once they do that, then and only then do they transition into a solution, which may be a medication or getting more sleep or whatever. You get the point, right? Right. But here's the thing. For a moment, imagine that instead of this, as soon as you walked into their office or whatever you want to call it, instead of asking you questions and finding out the underlying problem, they just whipped out, or the doctor just whipped out a package of pills, slammed them on the table, and was like, yeah, bro, just take this. It's the best product on the market. It's the best package of pills. It cures every illness, it cures every pain imaginable. It'd be like, well, doc, you haven't even asked me a single question. How can you be so sure that this is what's actually going to solve my problem? Right? Right. But here's the thing. Most of you sell like that. Most of you just say, well, my product is going to help you solve this pain, but you never educate them on the underlying problem and on the actual solution before revealing the product. And that's the problem, right? Right. So now that we have identified that, the next step we have to take is, or the next logical question we have to answer is, well, how do we make it so that we can, actually do this? Because knowing what we need to do is one thing, but knowing how to do it is a completely different thing altogether, right? Right. And in order to take people from step number one to, or stage number one to stage number three, is to do is by using a framework I've kind of developed over the years. It's a three-step framework on selling, and depending on what medium you use, so if you sell one-to-many or one-on-one, it's gonna kind of vary. There are gonna be some variations, and also depending on what you sell, if it's a webinar or an ad or a piece of content, like these things will influence the structure of this, but like the underlying formula, what you have to do on its own stays the same. So if you can just learn this formula, you're like going to be ahead of 99% of business owners. And the formula goes like this. Step number one, motivate. Step number two, educate. And step number three is then to simply close and overcome all objections. Now, since I'm a marketer, that means that I can specialize in one-to-many selling. So ads, webinars, content, stuff like that. That is what we will be primarily focusing on in this video. But again, just as I said, this formula will apply to one-to-one or one-on-one selling, but the step number two is going to be different in its nature. And I'll come to that in a moment, but it's just important that we clarify that. Now, let's just start off with me explaining the first step to you. Motivate. Like, what is motivating even about? Why do you have to do it? How do you do it? And why is it so important? Right? Right. Well, I'm guessing you already know what the word motivate means. It means to motivate somebody to do something, right? Right. But what do we want people, like, what do we want people to be motivated to want to do? Well, that's simple. We want them to be motivated to relieve a certain pain in their problem. So if we were selling to overweight people, we want to motivate them to want to lose the weight. We were selling to, I don't know, what's single people, and we wanted to motivate them to get rid of the pain of being single and actually find a partner, right? You get the point. But why do we want to do this? Why do we want to motivate people so much? Well, there are two, or actually, there's one main reason and then there's a secondary reason. But we will primarily focus on the one main reason, and that is that we want to make the value appear bigger. This is something Russell Brunson talks about a lot, especially in his first dot-com secrets book. And when I first read this, I couldn't understand it. But now, a couple of years later, where I've kind of spent more years in my marketing career, I get it 100%. Now, what this essentially means is that we want to make our product appear as valuable as possible. Now, the reason we want to do that is because something appears more valuable, first of all, people are ready to pay more money for it. And second of all, people are more likely to buy. Right? Right. So that means we want to make the pain appear as big as possible Because if we can then present our product as the solution to that pain, what does that mean, right? That we take more pain away from their problems, meaning there's bigger value, there's more value, meaning we can charge more, and people, again, what? More likely to buy. Exactly. So, how do we do this? How do we actually motivate people? How do we make this problem appear bigger? Well, we use something like this. This is again something I got from Russell Brunson. Again, if you read any of his books, you will know what I'm talking about. And there's this graph, and your prospect is kind of here in the middle, right? Now, on the left hand side, there is pain. On the right hand side, there is pleasure. Now, what you want to do is you want to show them the pain, all the pain that has been caused by this problem. So, if we go to our examples again, if you were selling to overweight people, you want to show them all the pain and suffering they've had to endure because they were overweight. You want to show them, I don't know, maybe struggling to get a partner, struggling in their dating life because they were overweight. Or again, talking about, and this is a key factor, talking about the past, but more importantly, the future. In other words, you don't just want to talk about how this problem has affected them in the past. You also want to talk about how this problem could affect them in the future if it got worse or if it stayed the same. How could this problem of being overweight snowball over the years? So maybe over the years, they still can't get a partner. They're still struggling in their dating life. And because of this, they feel so shit about themselves. And because they feel so shit about themselves, they try to kind of numb this feeling with junk food and with eating more. But because they do that, they put even more size on it, and it just kind of snowballs. You want to show them that future of pain. And then on the other hand, you have pleasure, right? Now, pleasure, unlike pain, where pain you mostly focus on the past, or actually it depends on the product, but actually that's not true. It really depends on the product, especially if you're selling something like life insurance, which I'm guessing nobody in the audience is, but you kind of have to really focus on the future pain. If they don't get life insurance, they die. What could happen to their families, future pain? That's actually not a bad example, but anyways, I'm kind of yapping without a real reason, without any substance, so I apologize. Anyways, pleasure, again, the same thing applies. What I wanted to say the whole time is that the same thing applies. Past and future. I kind of lost like 5 seconds just yapping absolute nonsense, and I just spat on my fucking hand. Anyways, past and future. So you didn't just want to show them how they felt before they developed this problem, or actually, in some cases, you don't want to talk about that at all, but you mainly want to focus on the future, right? You want to show them, well, what could your life look like if you had a six pack? What could your life look like? What would it look like if you had a attractive girlfriend your parents really like, right? Right. So mainly focusing on the future and of pain and pleasure. And here's the thing, right? You kind of want to go back and forth in between pain and pleasure, right? So it's kind of an emotional roller coaster. Think of that one girl in high school who gave you fucking mixed signals and shit. Anyways, yeah. So that's what you want to do when it comes to motivating people. Now, here comes the meat of selling, right? The main part of the selling formula, which is step number two, educate. Educating people. Now, again, why do we need to educate people? What do we need to educate them on? And like, how do we do it? Well, firstly, I already kind of touched on why we need to educate people with my doctor example, right? If somebody just comes up to you and slams a package of pills, you're not going to take it. But if he actually convinces you, he shows you that he understands the problem and he educates you on the problem, you're like, hold on, you know your shit and you want to buy from him. Why? Right. Well, but it's not that simple. Because here's the problem. Here's what most people get wrong. Most people believe that they need to educate the prospect on the actual problem, meaning they think they need to educate the prospect on why they are fat or on why they are single or on why they are poor. No, no, no. That is not what you fucking do. That is not how you sell to people. That is not how you complete step number two of this selling formula. What you do instead, or what you educate people on instead, is on why they have failed in the past, why other products haven't worked, why other methods haven't worked. And that's also going to open up the door for your product to give them the thing which no other product offers and essentially position you as the only viable solution in the market. Something I'm guessing you would want. Right, right. So how do you fucking do this, right? We know what we need to educate people on, like failure, like why they have failed in the past, but how the fuck do we do it, right? Right. Well, that's simple. And actually, one addition, we want to educate them on the failure and then on the solution, right? In other words, we say, well, the reason you haven't succeeded in the past is because of X, Y, and Z. So here is X, so you can finally get a girlfriend or lose that weight or whatever it is, whatever pain your product solves, right? Right, but how the fuck do we do this? Well, we use a quite simple but incredibly interesting and powerful method, something which has been used for centuries, heck, maybe even millennia, and that is stories. Now, if you've been in the marketing space or if you've been watching marketing videos, you've probably heard a billion different gurus a billion different times talking about stories or the fucking holy grail of marketing. They're the most persuasive thing you can use to persuade a human being. But like none of them actually say why that is or why stories are so important or why they're so important. I just said important twice. Never mind. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is none of them actually tell you why stories are so persuasive until your boy here comes up and explains it to you. So I want you to think of like fairy tales, right? Which were told to kids hundreds of years ago. Maybe like Snow White, or actually, I don't think that's 100 years old. But anyways, there are fairy tales, right, which have been told to kids all over the world for hundreds of years, right? Right. But here's the thing. What most people don't understand about fairy tales is that the reason people invented them wasn't so that kids would be entertained. They invented fairy tales so they could teach kids a lesson. That is why, if you go to old, like the original versions of most fairy tales, like Snow White, for example, pretty sure the witch, which, tries poisoning Snow White, ends up dying in the end. Now, the reason that's the case, the reason there's death and cruelty in a flipping child's story is because the message or the core principle of a story is to teach kids, hey, if you try to deceive people or you try to, you know, poison people with an apple, which obviously stands for deception and jealousy, stuff like that, it's not gonna end well for you. Now, here's the thing. These people or these parents hundreds of years ago could have just went up to their kids and said, hey, if you If you try to deceive people or if you're jealous of other people, it's not going to end well for you. But do you think that would have been as effective as telling them a story of Snow White, which, first of all, is way more entertaining, meaning kids are way more inclined to actually listen, and second of all, is actually, gives an actual tangible example of, hey, this witch tries deceiving Snow White, tries poisoning her out of jealousy, and in the end, she fucking dies. Which one do you think is more persuasive? Obviously, the story. And the main reason is, in the first example, you literally go up to them and you say to them, hey, this is how you should act. This is what you should do. This is what you shouldn't do. But in the other example, you just tell them a story. You're like, hey, this person did this and this happened to them. And then you let them draw their own conclusions. Which one do you think is more persuasive again? Obviously, it's number fucking two. Right, right. So, in other words, we just need to tell a story, be it your own story or a story of somebody you know or anybody really, that showcases failure and then a twist that transitions into the solution and then again showing how your product, the holy stutter, delivers on that solution the best and easiest way. So, how do we do that? Glad you asked. And obviously, I have a formula for telling stories as well. Shocker. I think like if you haven't caught on yet, I kind of like my formulas, right? And analogies and stuff. Right. So here's how the story formula goes. Here's how you tell stories which aren't just entertaining but are actually educational and are going to make people want to buy your product. Firstly, you show want, relatable. It's gonna REL, that stands for relatable. You show a want, then you show failure. This is good, failure. A lot of people believe that if they want to be persuasive or if they want to have authority in the market, obviously it depends on what you're selling, you may not even need authority. But many people believe that if they want to have authority, they need to seem perfect. But that's fucking bullshit. Matter of fact, failure, showing that you failed in the past is one of the most persuasive things you could do. We'll come to that in a second. So once failure, then plot twist. That's how I'm gonna call it. Solution, and then result. Now here's what all of these steps actually mean. Want, you want to be relatable to the prospect. You want to show pain. You want to show that you, like ideally you, were in the same position as them not so long ago. So you want to show a picture of you, being fat. If you're selling weight loss to fat people, you want to say, just a couple of years ago, just 5 years ago, I was just like you. I was overweight. I hated myself. I ate pizza every day. And again, you want to show relatable pain. So whatever pain your audience feels, you want to say you felt the same pain. And then you want to transition into failure. In other words, I've tried X, Y, and Z, all of the common methods they have tried, and I still saw no progress. Again, relating to them and making them see themselves in you. Very important. And then comes the plot twist. In other words, the realization. You want to say, but then I accidentally, keyword accidentally, you never discovered something on your own. You never figured out anything on your own. You either discovered it accidentally or somebody else showed it to you. That's very important because if you show you or if you say you figured it out on your own and they cannot figure it out on their own, it means that subconsciously you are better than them and obviously that's not persuasive. You don't want that. So you either say, I accidentally discovered, or I found the article, I saw this, or I had a mentor, or whatever. I met with a scientist and they showed me X, Y, and Z. They showed me why all of these methods are futile, why they do not work, and why I've never had success with any of these methods. And then you want to transition into the real solution. This is like the EU, like the fuck. I cannot pronounce this. Like, you know what I mean. I wrote it here. I cannot pronounce this. I'm European. Yeah, fucking. Like the solution. This is what I tried instead. All of these methods didn't work because of X, Y, and Z. Because this can work, so I tried this instead. And then results. You want to show like the results you got. So you lost the weight, or you got the fiance or girlfriend, or you made money, right? Or whatever it is you do, right? Right. Right. So to give an actual example of how this exact formula would apply to an actual story, let's just stick with our example of weight loss, a weight loss offer. So if I was selling weight loss or a diet plan or whatever, here's how here's like the first thoughts that come to mind. I'd say something like, you see, just a couple of years ago, I was in your shoes. I was 20 pounds overweight. I didn't know what to do with my life. I hated the way I looked. I hated the way I felt. Hitting, step number one, pain. Then step number two, failure. All of the common methods you've tried. I've tried every diet under the sun, ketos, carnivore, vegetarian, like everything you've heard of when it comes to dieting. I've tried it. Yet no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't stick with it. I kept falling back to my old ways. I was genuinely so desperate, and every time I failed, I felt even more self-conscious and just wanted to quit, right? It wasn't until I spoke with a friend of mine who is actually a health advisor, and he asked me a fundamental question, which was, well, Vuk, you've tried so many diets, but have you ever stuck with one of them? And at that moment, that is when it hit me. Again, the solution or the realization, the plot twist. You see, truth be told, every diet, and I mean every single one of them, works. As long as you're in a caloric deficit, meaning you eat less than your body needs. I don't know how to explain it in technical terms. If you're actually in the weight loss niche, you will be able to explain that more in detail. I'm not, so I can't. Blah, blah, blah. So the real trick to losing weight isn't having a perfect diet or doing this or doing that, but simply sticking with one diet you know works. But here's the problem, right? That's easier said than done. And I want you to know that's not your fault. Because just think about it. Over the last years, like maybe even decades, you've conditioned your taste buds and your neurons to connect or to perceive tasty foods, junk foods, chocolates with pleasure. Every time you walk past a McDonald's restaurant or past a open bar of chocolate sitting on the table in the living room, you immediately start imagining, or you immediately start feeling pleasure because you've been conditioned, or your taste buds, neurons, whatever, have been conditioned in a certain way that you perceive or that you link pleasure with these foods. So the trick to sticking with the diet is to break this link and connect the healthy foods, the diet you know works, to pleasure or with pleasure. And then you transition into, which is exactly why I've developed this in this program. Obviously, maybe you don't want to go into it right away, but again, I'm just giving you a general example so you understand how this works. Step number 3, close. Like, how do you close on people? What is it? Why do you need to do it? Right? Right. Well, at this point in the ad or VSL webinar, whatever it is, there are going to be mainly three types of people. And this is something I learned from Dan Henry. If you don't know him, he's a brilliant marketer. You should check him out. But anyways, here's the concept. Like, there are going to be three types of people. First of all, there's going to be your hell no's. In other words, people who say, hell no, I am never buying from you. I don't care how good this thing is. I don't trust you. I never want to buy from you. And truth be told, this is like going to be the majority of people. Doesn't matter how good you are at selling or how good, actually, well, it doesn't matter how good you are at selling. Most people are still going to say hell no. That's just the nature of it. Hell no. And then you're going to have your second group. It's going to be your hell yeah, right? They're going to be like, hell yeah. I want to buy this. I want to do this thing, right? Right. Now, this is also, unfortunately, the smallest group. This is the biggest. This is the smallest. Like, which one is in the middle? I said there are three groups. That's correct. Now, the third group is the second biggest one, and it's people on the fence, right? People who are like, well, I'm not sure. This sounds good and all, but like, what about this and what about that and what about this and that and blah, 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 blah. Now, your job is to go up to them and say, well, about X or about this thing you're thinking to yourself, there's a solution, or you don't need to worry about that because X, Y, and Z. All right, let me just check. I'm recording. Okay, good. In other words, you come to this fence, you grab it, and then you shake it, and then they just fall down and they turn into a hell yeah. Ideally, if you know how to close them. And just as we've discussed, closing somebody is nothing else than overcoming objections. Right? Right. Now, here's the interesting part. Or here's, yeah, really the interesting part about overcoming objections. The outdated way, or a way I don't really like to use or teach, is the head on approach, right? Let me just head on approach. I just wrote it down here, but this is the approach I do not like. So, what this basically means is you, after you delivered your presentation, you told your story, you did step number one and step number two, you addressed the objections head on. You're like, but right now, you might think to yourself, well, what will my wife think? Or what will this guy say about this? Or can I actually afford this? You might think this to yourself or this to yourself. But, or, well, let me tell you why that doesn't apply or why that isn't a concern. Now, the reason I don't like this approach is because, first of all, it's kind of way too direct for my liking. And if you don't have that much trust in the market, if you're not like a trusted authority, I feel like you there is a possibility the viewers go into a self-defense mode. They're like, well, yeah, you're just saying this to try to convince me. You're just, of course, you came up with all this stuff. Can like obviously there are some marketers, really successful marketers who use this, but and I'm not saying that this is a bad thing to do. Don't get me wrong, this is like a million times better than not addressing the objections at all. But I do believe there is a way more subtle and sneaky way, and that is just as I said, subtle way to address objections. Now, there are multiple ways you can do this. Now, my one of my favorite ways to do this is, or really the only way to do this, is to overcome these objections through stories or through retold experiences. So instead of saying, But I hear you. Right now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, what will my wife think about this? This is too good to be true. You say, when I just started out or when I just discovered this method, I thought to myself, well, this is too good to be true. But then I decided to give it a try anyways, and I achieved X, Y, and Z. That is a subtle, way more subtle way to overcome an objection. But there are certain objections which aren't really that easy, or you cannot overcome with yourself, with your retold experience. For example, what will my wife think? After all, I'm guessing you maybe didn't have to pay for a mentorship, or like it doesn't really translate that well into, oh, but when I just discovered this, I thought to myself, what will my wife think if I like, because there's no monetary investment, right? You didn't. Maybe there is, but still it doesn't translate as well. What you can do instead is take some of your already existing clients, like people who have already bought from you, and you ask them, hey, what is it? Or, of course, this is under the assumption that you already know what some of the main objections are going to be. If you don't know what those are, then just follow up on your email list and ask them, hey, uh, why didn't you buy our product? Obviously, I say right away, say, hey, blah, blah, blah. Thank you for attending the webinar or the ad or blah, 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 whatever. Watching the piece of content, and you just gather data. It's literally just interviewing prospects, which you should be doing already, gathering data. And then once you know what some of the most common objections are, for the sake of this example, let's just assume it's number one, wife, right? What will my wife think about this? Or, I don't know, this sounds too good to be true, right? Now, an alternative way is to go to your already existing client, somebody who has already bought and has results, and you ask these people, hey, who in here before buying the product was concerned about number one and number two, like, or any of these objections? And then somebody's gonna come along and he's gonna be like, he's gonna raise his hand and he's gonna be like, yeah, me, that's me. Like, I was concerned with number one and objection and all of these objections. And then you ask them to film a short video where they say, yeah, in the beginning, before I bought this product, I was concerned with this and this. I had these objections, but then I decided to do it anyways, and now I get these amazing results. Again, that's the subtle way to address objections, to destroy objections, if you might. Again, just as I said, the head-on approach isn't necessarily bad, but if you don't have that much authority in the market, and if you are uh, like, the subtle way is just more subtle and, in my opinion, more persuasive. But the head-on approach is still better than doing nothing. So congrats on making it till the end of this video. One quick message before you go though, and that is that if you can see that the things I talk about in these videos, like messaging, marketing, branding, and all the strategies I share with you are the key to hitting that next level in your business you know you deserve to be at. But for some reason, you you get it, but you kind of don't get it. Or maybe you're asking yourself, well, this is all nice, but how do I actually implement this into my business, into my industry, so that I can actually achieve the results I desire? Listen up, because I want to make a special offer just for you. All you have to do is to scroll down, open the description of this video, click the first link, and book a call. And if you're qualified, I will literally personally help you implement these exact strategies into your business so you can hit the next level. Fair enough? All right, then see you on the other side.